I actually never thought I would be having thoughts of what I would do with my kids in the middle of a war. Call it privileged, but I truly thought that I was insulated living in the US. However, we now have the war in Gaza, we have the war in Ukraine, and we have the war in Iran that is looming and could escalate into World War III. Something that feels very modern about parenting is you can be sitting in your kitchen feeding your kids breakfast while your phone is showing you children in another country running from bombs. Your brain is trying to process both of these same things at the same time. And it made me start wondering what that constant exposure to global suffering is doing to our nervous system as parents. There's a study out of the University of California that looked at how media exposure to mass violence, including time spent watching the news and parents' immediate emotional reactions, influence how they interacted with their children afterward. Just as the saying goes, you are what you eat, and in some ways, you are what you consume through media. The researchers used several frameworks to understand the results, but one of the most important was the family stress model. This model shows that parent stress can influence parenting behavior, which then affects children's emotional environment. And as someone who would describe myself as chronically online, this part really stood out to me. I noticed that the algorithm is constantly pushing mass violent incidents into my feed. And the article actually talks about this. It mentions that social media may have a more direct impact on people's perception of risk rather than traditional media. And I mean, honestly, that's not surprising. Watching the nightly news or reading a newspaper is something you do just once and then you put it down. But algorithmic media that we are in nowadays just works differently. It'll keep pushing similar content to you over and over again. So you might see images or videos of violence multiple times in a single evening while you're just like doom scrolling after your kids go to bed. But that study also explained that exposure to that mass violence through the media can be associated with anxiety or sleep disruptions and symptoms that are really similar to post traumatic stress. So even when parents are like not directly affected by these events themselves, they are experiencing that effect. And another interesting finding in these articles are that mothers and fathers sometimes responded differently in their parenting after being exposed to these incidents. Mothers of younger children were sometimes more likely to withdraw or ignore their children after having these strong emotional reactions to the news. And that study also found that anxious reactions in mothers were associated with decreases in positive parenting behavior in the moment. But at the same time, when parents reacted to the images of violence with anger or sadness, they actually were sometimes more likely to emphasize rules and respect for authority with their children, which researchers are assuming is kind of a protective response. However, fathers showed a slightly different pattern. In some cases, fathers demonstrated more positive parenting behavior after exposure to mass violent events. And the researchers suggest that seeing the grief of victims' families may have promoted these fathers to engage more kindly and nicely with their own children. There was also this study of Italian young adults that introduced the concept called an infodemic. And to simplify it, you're sitting in your living room scrolling and constantly exposed to these mass violence events, and your anxiety can just increase, even if these events were happening halfway across the world, especially if you were already predisposed to anxiety or worry, like me. So to put it even simpler, you're not just consuming information, you're actually consuming distress. The researchers also talked about media vicarious trauma, which this term is normally used with like social workers and therapists or other public servants who regularly witness trauma. But now the general public is seeing more than ever before through media. an infodemic. There's also a concept called media dependence theory, which explains that during times of crisis or uncertainty, people naturally seek out more information to reduce that uncertainty. If there's a threat, you want to understand it. However, that can lead to desensitization. That article explains that constant exposure to violence can create a defense mechanism. Well, people become numb to the suffering. While this protects you from immediate emotional overwhelm, the long term risk is normalization of violence and destruction, which can diminish our perception of how severe these events actually are. One thing that really stood out to me while reading research about parents actually raising children during war is that parents still play a really important protective role for their children, even in these situations. For instance, parents may encourage open sharing of feelings, providing distraction or help with problem solving, or supporting children in accepting their emotions without any judgment. And those kinds of strategies have helped children perceive stressful situations as less threatening and more manageable. Researchers often refer to this as supportive emotional socialization, which is essentially how parents help children understand and regulate their emotions. Studies looking at families exposed to war have shown that these kinds of parental behaviors can act as a protective factor against psychological distress in children even when parents themselves are experiencing high levels of stress or symptoms of trauma, researchers suggest that many are still able to engage in adaptive emotional regulation strategies with their children. And when they do, it tends to lead to better emotional outcomes for their kids. What I found really interesting about that is even in environments that are extremely unstable, the relationship between the parent and their child can still play a very stabilizing role, which made me think about something. If parents raising children in the middle of real conflict are still acting as emotional buffers for their kids, it makes me wonder that means for parents like us who are witnessing these events from far away through a screen. Because even if danger is not like physically around us, the stress and the fear absorbed from constantly watching these events still show up in the emotional environment we create for our children. And that brings the whole question back to our nervous system. Again, reading about parents raising children in actual conflict zones also made me notice something about my own thoughts lately. I never used to imagine what I would do with my kids in the middle of a war, but recently I have caught myself thinking about it. Where would we go? What I grab first? How can I keep them calm? And I don't think I'm the only parent having these thoughts right now. When you're constantly exposed to these images of conflict, your brain naturally starts trying to make sense of the threat. Even if it's happening thousands of miles away, your mind starts asking you these questions. What would I do if this happened here? And it's actually a very normal psychological response when people are exposed to uncertainty or crisis. They naturally seek out the information and mentally rehearse the possible outcomes. It's the brain trying to reduce uncertainty and regain a sense of control. But it also means that us as modern parents are carrying around a kind of background awareness that previous generations did not experience in the same way. So, what do we do with all of this? Because the reality is that modern parents are exposed to more global suffering than any generation before us. We see wars unfold in real time. We see families running with their children. We see things not very long ago most people would have only read about briefly in newspapers. And our brains are trying to process all of this while we are still raising kids in a very normal moment, making breakfast and helping them find their shoes and reading them a bedtime story and at the same time, somewhere else in the world, another parent is trying to do those exact same things under completely different circumstances. In some ways, it probably increases empathy. It definitely makes the world feel smaller, but it can also quietly increase anxiety and the sense of responsibility for things that are far out of our control. And one thing that really stood out to me reading about these parents raising children during war, even in extremely unstable environments, what protects children the most is not a perfect environment, it's a regulated parent, a parent who helps them process emotions, a parent who offers stability when things feel uncertain, a parent who can make the world feel understandable and safe again, which means that in some ways, the most important thing we can do as parents living far away from these conflicts is just to protect our own nervous system too. And that doesn't mean ignore the world, but by recognizing that our minds were never designed to absorb the distress of the entire planet every single day, because the environment we create inside our home still really matter, and our children are experiencing the world through us first. Thanks for staying to listen to me talk about this. If anything resonated with you, I would love for you to let me know in the comments. Please like and comment and subscribe. It really helps me see that there are people out there watching and they also like this content as well. Share with your friends and family. Thank you so much.